Why is the Saudi Arabian royal lineage so wealthy and powerful? It was the 1930s, and you were the head of the Saud family, the ruling dynasty of Saudi Arabia, a kingdom surrounded by vast deserts on the Arabian Peninsula. After centuries of nomadic life in the scorching, barren deserts under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, you were finally free and had unified your country, but you were still poor. You had to build everything from scratch. But where do you even start when all you have around you is sand? That very dilemma was what King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia pondered night after night in the early 1930s. On the other side of the world, in the western United States, there was a company called Standard Oil of California. This company was searching for a new oil field, one that was larger and of higher quality than what was currently available in the U.S. Why? Because oil was the key ingredient for producing plastic, fertilizer, machinery, weapons, essentially everything needed to sustain the industrial power of a global superpower. They came to the Arabian Peninsula because they saw similarities between it and California. But there were a few problems. First, the company was not guaranteed permission to dig up Saudi Arabia's deserts. As you know, the cultural differences between Muslims and the Western world were significant. And secondly, there was no certainty that oil even existed beneath this endless stretch of sand. The first problem had to be solved before the second could even be considered. Fortunately for the company, their concern aligned perfectly with what King Ibn Saud needed, a partner who could offer him a chance to transform his nation. The king granted the Americans permission to establish an oil drilling site in Tehran. Then came the second problem. After many grueling days in the vast desert, tirelessly digging, drilling, and exploring, the Americans and the Saudis finally struck gold, the largest oil field in the world. King Ibn Saud had found the solution to his dilemma. With just a simple nod to a group of foreigners from halfway across the world, those foreigners brought him wealth, an unimaginable amount of wealth. And with that wealth, the king began to build his nation. At its core, the Saudi royal family's wealth comes from oil. It's that simple, Taram. But let me remind you of one thing. Not every resource-rich country ends up as wealthy and powerful as Saudi Arabia. Many other nations also have vast oil reserves, yet today they lie in ruins. Just look at Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Venezuela. For now, let's focus on Saudi Arabia. Back then, Saudi Arabia was like a man holding a fortune whilst living in a crime-ridden neighborhood. Many countries envied Saudi Arabia's wealth and started to entertain the idea of stealing its golden treasure. If you were the king of Saudi Arabia, what would you do? You couldn't leave the neighborhood. You couldn't just throw away all your money either. So what was the solution? You needed a powerful force to protect you, one that the entire crime-ridden neighborhood feared. And who better than the most reliable business partner you already had, the world's greatest superpower? King Ibn Saud saw it the same way and took his relationship with the U.S. a step further. He allowed the Americans to establish military bases on the sacred land of Islam. Not all Arabs were happy about this. We'll get to that later. But the benefits of this decision far outweighed the drawbacks. The Americans gained influence in the Middle East and secured a steady supply of high-quality oil. Meanwhile, the Saudi royal family gained an abundance of wealth and an elite-level protector. A partnership couldn't get any better than this. But, as in any relationship, conflicts are bound to arise. If those conflicts can be resolved, the bond only grows stronger. That was the case for Saudi Arabia and the U.S., and it made the Saud dynasty even more powerful. Aside from Saudi Arabia, the U.S. had other allies in the Middle East, but one of its closest allies was far from popular among its neighbors. In 1967, war broke out between Israel and the Arab nations. The U.S. found itself in a dilemma as it had allies on both sides. War erupted again in 1973. This time, the U.S. directly supported Israel against the Arab coalition. The Arab nations, including Saudi Arabia, were furious. In retaliation, they imposed an oil embargo on the U.S., causing oil prices to skyrocket. When the Americans threatened Saudi Arabia in response, do you know what the Saudi royal family said? Go ahead. At worst, we'll return to living in the desert, just as our ancestors did. The U.S. started to worry. Now, do you see just how powerful the Saudi royal family is? With just a single statement, they could force the world's #1 superpower to back down. The U.S. had no choice but to reconcile with Saudi Arabia. To ease tensions, they jointly created a system that would later change the fate of many nations, the petrodollar. We won't go into too much detail about the petrodollar here, but in simple terms, oil worldwide would only be sold in US dollars. Essentially, this meant the US could simply print money and acquire oil for free. In return, they provided massive military aid to Saudi Arabia. Through this arrangement, the US maintained its dominance over the global financial system, while Saudi Arabia gained a powerful shield to safeguard its future. Do you know who built the oil extraction facilities for the oil company we discussed earlier? It wasn't the Americans. It was a family whose name you will immediately recognize: Bin Laden. Have you ever wondered how Osama bin Laden had so much money and weapons to sustain his network? That's right, it came from his wealthy and powerful family. Osama was the son of the head of the largest construction conglomerate in Saudi Arabia, the Bin Laden Group. With private education and a fortune from his father, Osama used that money to fuel his belief in a world ruled solely by Arabs. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Osama and his fighters traveled to Afghanistan to drive out the Soviets. The US was thrilled about this. Osama's guerrilla fighters, trained by the CIA and supplied with American weapons, managed to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Osama then returned to Saudi Arabia. But when he came back, a new villain had emerged to threaten Saudi Arabia: Saddam Hussein. He decided to invade Kuwait, claiming that Kuwait had always been a province of Iraq and that its vast oil reserves should belong to Iraq. Saddam's invasion sent shockwaves through Saudi Arabia, throwing the royal family into panic. Osama, the son of a man who was a close friend of the Saudi royal family, stepped forward and volunteered to fight Saddam Hussein. In Osama's view, Saddam deserved to die. After all, he had used chemical weapons against his own people. But Saudi Arabia was skeptical. The Saudi king asked Osama, "What do you have to fight Saddam Hussein? Kuwait is a desert. There are no caves for you to hide in." Osama's answer was faith. But the Saudi king did not share Osama's faith. He trusted his white-skinned allies, the very people Osama viewed as devils from the outside world, far more. The US had been waiting for this moment. They intervened, pushed Saddam back into Iraq, and Saudi-US relations grew even stronger. Osama, feeling betrayed, took matters into his own hands. He mobilized his fighters and established the infamous Al-Qaeda network to protect his ideology. Al-Qaeda committed numerous atrocities worldwide, prompting the US to demand answers from Saudi Arabia. In response, the Saudis revoked Osama's Saudi citizenship to appease the Americans. But Osama was already one step ahead. When the 9/11 attacks happened, 15 of the hijackers were Saudi citizens, and once again the US turned to Saudi Arabia for answers. With no other choice, Saudi Arabia had to comply with American demands to pacify its anger. Over time, the events faded into history. The petrodollar system remained intact. The US continued supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia. The bond between the Saud dynasty and the US only grew stronger. Saudi Arabia then used American weapons to fund wars across the Middle East, aiming to counter its age-old rival, Iran. Saudi Arabia bombed Yemen, committing numerous war crimes throughout the region. A journalist with ties to the US spoke out, exposing the atrocities committed by the Saudi royal family. Do you know what happened to him? And yet, the US did nothing. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman faced no consequences from the US. And now he is even openly forging ties with China, the United States' greatest geopolitical rival. And still, the US does nothing. From nomadic desert tribes to the wealthiest and most powerful people on Earth, the Saud family has managed to make the world's strongest superpower bow to them.